From the RSNA, this is the Radiology Artificial Intelligence Podcast. My name is Paul Yee, and I'm a radiologist and co-host of the podcast.
And my name is Ali Tejani, and I'm a radiologist and co-host of the podcast. Each month, we dive into the hottest topics in radiology AI and talk with leading experts, thought leaders, and movers and shakers in the field. Welcome back to the Radiology AI Podcast. Today, we continue our conversation on large language model reporting practices, bringing the conversation now to guidelines that are either currently or will soon be available to both reviewers and authors. You'll also hear more about less commonly talked about topics, including the ecological footprint of large language models. And you'll learn more about our guests as we wrap up this conversation.
Yeah, one thing I think a lot about is, as a radiologist, we have these AI models and we kind of just assume that they're trained on some reference standard, which is now our preferred term for things that we might have called ground truth. But, I trained previously in orthopedic surgery for a couple of years, and I'll tell you, the surgeons often look to themselves as the experts for things like fractures or even looking at MRIs of tumors, believe it or not. I will say that it's interesting. So I wonder if there's a future where you have like multidisciplinary conferences where you have different LLM agents that take on the persona of a radiologist, of a surgeon, of a pathologist, and you have them kind of weighing in. It also bears into mind like things like inter-rater variability, even for things like segmentation. I think it's unclear what is actually reliable reference standard. I think on any given day we might be off a few pixels or voxels here and there, and so I don't know. I'm just thinking off the top of my head. That's just what comes to mind. I don't know if you guys have thought about that. Ali, Tugba, Merel.
I'm thinking about it now, though.
We are not stochastic in nature, but those models are. So they might be saying something different next year than they would now. So I don't know. I feel it's such a complicated topic. I can't really wrap my head around the whole thing, but that's some aspect, and also like the prompt engineering part. If you give a different prompt, you get a different agent. So there should be some standardization and some form of longitudinal monitoring, I guess, because of that stochastic.
Do you really think we as humans are also not stochastic or kind of random as opposed to deterministic? Like, I know that for me, you give me an image depending on the time of day. If I have depending on what the clinical indication is, I might say something very different.
Yeah, but it's within your own frame, right? Like it will. Well, it can be something out of character. I don't know. This is more like philosophical, but I kind of will always be myself, more or less, even though you can say random things at times. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, also, what about as we, in the practice of medicine, right, we evolve. I wonder if it's analogous to ChatGPT kind of changing performance over time. But Tugba, I'm sorry, you had something you wanted to say. Please.
So I wouldn't definitely say that I am not stochastic, because there are a lot of research. Maybe you know that if you read the Thinking Fast and Slow from Daniel Kahneman.
Yeah, rest in peace.
Yes, absolutely. And people are actually in different conditions or with different heuristics. They can do completely different things, and that's why I cannot promise that I can be 100% stochastic. Maybe we are really similar to large language models in that person.
Or maybe it's the way that we express something may be different, but the gist of the message is similar, right? Just as Merel was saying that, we are who we are, and maybe it's the way we express things that change. But, we've talked about some really great points here. I'm going to have to ask our guests to stay on for a couple more hours here so we can make sure we dive into each topic. But briefly, as I transition into one of the things that both Merel and Tuba mentioned, last episode we had Christian Bluethgen on, and Christian gave another talk before that to the journal's training editorial board. And it was a great review of AI reporting, and the discussion then went into, some of the limitations and the inconsistencies that do limit reproducibility of the content that we're seeing. We've seen a lot of use cases, as we talked about. Merel, you said we started seeing some more image analysis work coming out. We've seen quite a bit on answering case of the day type of questions from different organizations. We've seen taking unstructured data and making it structured. But if you think about trying to replicate those studies, it's challenging, and maybe it's because of the model being stochastic. But that being said, there are factors, in my opinion, and that came out of that discussion, that are missing in the papers that limit our ability to reproduce exactly what was done. For example, one thing that I can start the discussion here to convey one of the points is, how many times are we prompting the model, right? Was a model prompted just once, 3 times, 5 times? Was the output that was represented, or the performance metric that was reported, was that a representation of an average of several attempts and several outputs? It's very hard, I think, if someone just presents results of a one-time prompt to a model, to then expect that the next person reading the article can expect similar results, right? But you never know. Same thing with prompts and prompt engineering, right? Was prompt engineering used? If so, what were the tactics? Was it chain of thought? Was it few shot? Was it zero shot? So any thoughts on what are some of the limitations, if there are any, of reporting large language model research right now?
Yeah, so I think the issues that persist that limit the reproducibility and also the evaluation are mostly due to a lack of standardization across the studies, and also a limited explicit use of evaluation dimensions. So this is also nicely discussed in the review from Nigam Shah's lab at Stanford I mentioned earlier. There is an absence of a consistent categorization framework in all of these studies. That means that a lot of these studies fail to clearly categorize what is being addressed and how it is addressed well enough to finally make comparisons between these studies. And especially if you want to see or paint a bigger picture in the landscape of LLM research, this obviously creates a challenge. The other issue that I mentioned earlier is an inconsistency that when it comes to evaluation criteria. Maybe because there's no well-known consensus for that, which is why we're also having this talk on which of these dimensions should be examined and which metrics we should be using for specific tests. We see a very high heterogeneity of approaches. Some of these studies rely solely, for instance, on output accuracy, while others include dimensions such as factuality or comprehensiveness or harm. And I mean, a metric like accuracy is very important, but to see that it absolutely dominates the study landscape, with a use in over 95% of these studies that exclusively use accuracy, that gives you an impression that this might not be optimal. So it makes sense to use accuracy, obviously, if you have a classification problem for a balanced data set, but not if you, say, have a setting where you generate text freely, and more than one solution may be acceptable. And on that note, it is also not a very realistic evaluation to have an LLM choose between several options in a multiple choice fashion like we do in university tests, for instance. So there's definitely other dimensions that need to be considered when you want to evaluate an LLM and the quality of the generated answer. And only very few studies use these extra dimensions. For instance, fairness, bias, and toxicity was only assessed in 15% of the studies. The same with robustness, and even fewer studies consider dimensions like calibration or uncertainty, which in medicine are pretty vital for understanding how reliable a model works. And I think to address these issues that I just highlighted, we think we need standardized task definitions and also evaluation dimensions that allow for a more comprehensive evaluation beyond these metrics like accuracy, to establish a more consensus-driven guidance for evaluating these LLMs for healthcare purposes.
So exactly, and so Christian also mentioned in his lecture. So this, according to a recent review article of LLM applications in radiology, prompts were provided only 70% of the published papers. And this aligns with my own experience reading or reviewing recent articles. And I also believe and agree with you, Ali. Prompting is a crucial part of the methodology, and researchers should disclose their exact prompts along with the methods they followed while generating these prompts. And of course, all the details about the model version and the parameters they use should be reported. And moreover, I think authors should include examples of the failure cases and not just showcase their best results. And another important is I want to point out is that as these models evolve, the evaluation metrics evolve with them, and traditional metrics like AUC, sensitivity, or specificity may not be sufficient to evaluate these models' outputs. And we need additional metrics that quantify the correctness or semantic similarities of the output. And the researchers should be careful to select their metrics for their own research.
Yeah, the metrics part, I think it's super interesting and also gets complicated quickly. We saw this also in the AI research field, that now there is a common understanding that only one metric is insufficient. I recently wrote also an editorial about that. That starts to be common knowledge now. I think we could copy that to LLM assessment, but then AUC or accuracy doesn't even compute for that. I don't think so. There is these traditional called n-gram based metrics where they just look at the sequence of the words being similar to a example text, but then it can be the same. It can have like a high score on that, but mean something completely different because the word none or no was not similar, but actually that changes the whole meaning of the sentence, if you understand what I mean. So now there is other metrics being proposed in both medicine and radiology. A lot of those articles are preprint papers. And what you also see is there's development towards like fact checking metrics. So not only the words, but also that it actually is true. Of course, that in itself is a whole philosophical concept. What is true, anyways? But let's leave that aside, right? So there's that, and yeah. So what's also I think really difficult, and you ideally you want to really replicate research, but we might have to accept that it's not 100% feasible to report transparently. For example, what if you use a third-party model that meanwhile is updated, right? And we don't have any, it's not transparent. So I wouldn't know what the OpenAI folks are doing, and they also don't disclose. So you could argue that then only open source models should be used in academic research, but it might not be realistic. I don't know. Like, time will tell, I guess. But we have to be as transparent as possible, I think. And like Ali said, like the prompt strategy, but also the maybe in an appendix, just the whole prompts, the whole sequence. Also, how many tries per prompt, and yeah, the time of access, just like you would do in a website reference, and things like temperature and so on and so forth. So basically echoing what you are all saying. And I have yet to see like really how you say it, like replicability research, like one group replicating results of the other. But that would be something interesting as well, because then you have the factor time. It might be that you get completely different outcomes. Yeah. So it's an interesting field.
I love that. I think that's idea of timestamps for the models would be really helpful, especially as we change, Merel, like you were saying, every few days, right? So knowing exactly which model iteration was used, what the date of access was, I could see that becoming a standard. And I'd hope that, honestly, sometimes when reviewing papers, I may request that, hey, can you clarify it, right? When was the model accessed? How many times? What was the date? So I'd love to see that. Yeah.
So we've identified these different potential challenges with academic research, right? With large language models, with these foundation models, including reproducibility, making sure that evaluations for, pardon me, um, just all of these different, let's say, very loosely, I'm going to say, is hyperparameters you can choose when making prompts, when evaluating these models. Are there any reporting guidelines under development tailored for LLM research that can help maybe standardize these things and give a list of best practices? And if so, are there any definite top contenders?
So currently, every journal is trying to create their own set of rules and recommendations regarding the use of LLMs. However, I believe we will need a specific guideline tailored only for LLM research. On the other hand, I cannot help but think of that XKCD comic about standards, or quote unquote how standards proliferate. You know, the one where there are 14 competing standards and two people are discussing how ridiculous it is and decide to create a universal standard to cover every possible use case, but they end up creating the 15th competing standard. Jokes aside, I do believe we need a universal standard for LLMs. I'm happy to hear that there are ongoing efforts to develop such standard by the Kangaroo Initiative with which stands for ChatGPT, Generative AI, and LLMs for accountable reporting and use guidelines. And I think they have listed in their preference several different phases, and I believe they are like at the end of the first phase, which involves identifying the key areas to be included in the Delphi survey, publishing a systematic review and bibliometric analysis, and they are right now likely to moving into the second phase, which involves identifying the items that will be included in the into the statement. So watch that kangaroo space.
Yeah, I believe there's a couple, but none of them I think came out yet. There's also this other initiative called Chart, which is a protocol for the development of chatbot assessment reporting tool for clinical advice. So it seems that that's not radiology specific, but more on the like decision support area. And I'm not in that group, so I wouldn't know the details, but they're in development with the usual Delphi process, just like Tripod AI, for example. And I could see a claim LLM. Like, I don't know that we are developing that yet, but you know, yeah, there's some specifics to LLM reporting that are not in any claim guideline right now.
I am not currently aware that there are already established guidelines for that, but some are in development. Most notably, I think that is a guideline coming from UCLA in the US and from Oxford in the UK. That is the guideline for ChatGPT, general artificial intelligence, and natural large language models for accountable reporting and use guidelines, or Kangaroo in short. This guideline seeks to establish a cross-disciplinary consensus on the ethical use, disclosure, and proper reporting of all these technologies in academia. And as far as I could see in the literature, this involves a three-step process where you first do an ongoing systematic review of these developments to understand the sort of shared ideas that the authors have, the findings and the reporting standards that are being used in the research at this point, and then attempt to formulate guidelines for its use and disclosure. Then a bibliometric analysis of existing author guidelines. So the goal here would be to evaluate already existing guidelines that may be not tailored for LLMs specifically, but maybe of some use for drafting up these new guidelines. And then the final step would be a Delphi process. I think that's a known concept where you basically involve a lot of experts from various specialties that go through a multi-step process and agree on recommendations that can finally be used to construct these guidelines and disseminate them for the general community, obviously. So this is Kangaroo, and maybe others here also have an opinion on that. This is, I think, the most notable attempt I've seen. They are not yet published. I'm not sure what the state of this guideline is. I also found a guideline called CHART, that is a chatbot assessment reporting tool that is based of authors in Ontario and Canada. It's also registered with the Equator network and also will involve a Delphi process. And the aim of this guideline is to create a reporting checklist and a flow diagram that basically allows for a robust and consensus-based assessment.
No, it was just a thing we didn't talk about yet, but what I would love to see is the ecological footprint or energy consumption per, I don't know, per use, per paper reported as well. Because this is also a trend. We now have GPT-4o Mini, which is like a bit leaner than the Omni one. And that could be a nice addition too, I think. Very hard to verify, but yeah.
I think this ecological footprint should be included into the model cards.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be nice.
I'd love every time I prompted a model to tell me exactly how, what the footprint was for that specific instance. I think it's so easy to use the models without understanding how much of a burden it can be on the environment too. So I really like that we brought that into the conversation, because I think it's a topic that doesn't get enough attention. Really quickly, going back to these reporting guidelines, and thank you for sharing these resources with us. I hope our listeners are motivated to go look these up and learn more about them. I know I definitely will. It's interesting, that we have these big groups come together from different perspectives to create these guidelines. How often do they have to reconvene then to update the guidelines? I feel like as we start seeing as we've talked about, it's rapidly evolving, it's changing very frequently. But do the principles change in the guidelines, or is it more or less just the technology and how robust it is, how good it is, essentially, that wouldn't necessarily mandate updating the guidelines more than on a maybe annual basis for a review? I don't know. I think it's such a frontier, right? Like, how often do we update, or do we even reevaluate the guidelines once they're established in their final form initially?
So I don't know. I think, as you said, the principles remain the same. I mean, they have been the same for decades, I guess. Just sound research, reporting every step, so that another group can exactly replicate the experiment. That doesn't change, but there will be new options that we don't know of yet. For example, like the advent of large language model itself is something we couldn't have seen coming, really, and there will be something like that next year or even earlier that nobody sees coming. And then we need an update. I don't know. I guess you're always a bit behind on those guidelines. Always lag a little bit behind because they take a lot of time and it's also a huge effort. What I think is even more important though is like that people get educated on the basic principles of doing sound research, or that is something that's even more important than updated guidelines in my mind.
So I think you are right, Oli. Is if you look at uh, the pillars of the science haven't changed, of course. If you follow the guidelines, it is you can think that you need to also share your prompts, for example. But going back to that review article, but this is not to, in practice, it might be different. And 30% of the researchers are not sharing their prompts. So maybe that's why I was thinking that maybe we can just create a addendum or kind of like extension for claim, and maybe to address this recent advancements and specific challenges posed by LLMs. And this addendum could be then revised annually or maybe as needed, and later it could be incorporated into the next full update, because I know that the 2024 update was released recently and it might be too early for a complete overhaul. And I know that Tripod AI update has recently been published and Start AI is currently under preparation. And this indicates that updating guidelines will likely become a routine practice rather than an exception.
I wouldn't be surprised if we saw extensions for the existing guidelines. I think that's an interesting topic, and you read my mind, because my next question was, can we adapt claim to large language model research? I think we've talked about the principles are similar, right? It's still a model that needs to be trained, it has to be tested, but there are certain nuances in terms of the methodology that we've touched on here. So it'd be interesting to see what an extension would look like, not just for claim, but for other reporting guidelines in our field.
Yeah, so claim, I know that originally it was, I'm sorry, I'm starting again. So yeah, obviously there is the famous claim guidelines. These were, as far as I know, not originally drafted up when, or sorry, once again. So then there is the claim guidelines. We've talked about this previously on and offline. And I mean, these guidelines were drawn up at a time when LLMs were not such a big topic yet. So a lot of the considerations that went into them, I think, were more broadly focused on deep learning approaches. And I think something that could enhance the usability or the usefulness of claim for LLMs would be to make it an explicit item in the list when it comes to the inference step, because usually with large language models, for the vast majority of use cases, you don't want to modify them or fine tune them for your use case. Instead, you want to prompt them, and the outputs of LLMs heavily rely on prompting. So I think that this, if you want to use it for LLMs, should be an explicit item in the claim list. The model parameters that are being used for inference or test time, such as temperature, top P or top K, if you use frequency, penalty, or something like that, because all of these definitely influence the output of your model. The other big thing is obviously also the prompting strategy that you're using. If you are using a very open prompt, or if you use techniques like chain of thought prompting, where you get the model to think in separate discrete steps, or self-consistency, for instance, or if you go into maybe more agentic patterns where you have a planning step and then you have the model fulfill certain steps. So there's a lot of complexity in this, which is not really reflected in the claim guidelines so far.
All right, we're heading into the last moments and minutes of our podcast. We want to end this by leaving this pretty open ended for whatever's on your mind. Do you have any advice for our listeners out there, whether related to large language models, what we talked about, or anything else? For Merel, for instance, I'm curious about your perfume influencer background. Do you have any advice maybe on what type of fragrance to choose? Is it based on the time of day, your mood, your outfit? But you don't have to answer that one specifically. But we're leaving this pretty open ended.
Yeah, I actually love that question. I hope our listeners are also a bit perfume aficionados, right? It really depends on your personality type. Like lots of people want a signature fragrance. They are recognized by other people want something seasonal. Me, for example, I could even switch like during the day or layer them or it's really up to you how you are as a person, but in general like more citrusy fragrances are better for summer, and then there's vanilla and amber, and those more heavy large molecule notes are better for winter. Yeah, very generally speaking.
All right, I'll keep that in mind.
Yeah, actually, I learned about, you mentioned layering. I remember when I was in Stanford at the Stanford Mall, we went into that one shop, and the salesperson she mentioned to my girlfriend, "Are you familiar with the concept of fragrance layering?" And we were like, "What? No."
It must have been Joe Malone. Yeah, it's a way for them to sell you more products, in fact. So, but you don't need, you can just layer at home. There's no need to buy like two fragrances. But yeah, it's a commercial strategy. In fact, it's a whole world in itself. But yeah.
I had never heard that term before. One sentence that I really liked about the kangaroo guidelines was that they mentioned that standard reporting guidelines for the scholarly community are especially needed to prevent a modern Tower of Babel effect, in which different parties would create a variety of bespoke guidance and regulations, but would be incapable of communicating with each other. And I thought that was a pretty good picture for why this is needed.
There is something I also want to share with the audience. Like, I can imagine many listeners being a bit intimidated. I just wanted to say to those that are intimidated by the body of knowledge, just start somewhere, read a few overview articles. That's how we all started. And I think it's really important that you do follow or have somebody, maybe a colleague that follows it, where you can learn from, follow the developments in general in AI and computer science related to radiology. So it doesn't matter if you don't understand the whole thing, but as long as you are able to follow some general trends and maybe focus on a smaller topic that speaks to you, then already you can make a contribution to the field.
And my recommendation for the people who wants to educate themselves is, of course, there are a lot of resources right now, but you can also watch the videos by Andrei Karpathy. Maybe you have heard that him. He is really like breaking it down to the really lay terms, and you don't need to uh, code, or you don't need to be at least expert on coding to understand his lectures.
And maybe something along these lines from my side. So that's usually how I respond to someone that asks me how to get more familiar with the field. It's a really good strategy, I think, to just pick a problem that you're curious about and then try to solve that specific little problem from end to end with these methods. That's the strategy where you learn most, when you just try to work through all of the aspects of such a project yourself.
Thank you all. And I think that with that, our listeners, you have some homework now. So take that to heart. I think I agree that those are some of the best ways to learn, especially as we try to keep up with how quickly things are changing, is really to get that hands-on experience and to work with it from end to end. Tugba, Merel, and Christian, thank you so much again for joining us. We're so happy that we could make this happen and that we could learn from your expert advice, from your diverse perspectives. And we hope that we can keep the conversation going. So looking forward to seeing you all again. And to our listeners, we hope that we can see you again at our next recording and our next episode. Take care and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for joining us for this episode. Check out Radiology AI for more content on large language models and AI in radiology. Also, check out the blog post accompanying this episode to learn more about the resources that you heard of. Subscribe for the Radiology AI podcast for more discussion on content from the journal and hot topics in our field.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Radiology Artificial Intelligence Podcast. Shout out to Yuri Ishimchisen for our podcast music and to the RSNA podcast staff.
Email us at podcasts@rsna.org anytime with questions, feedback, or suggestions.